If she's no longer in this house, then you've already lost the one person who loved this family without asking for anything.
What have I done?
Take your suitcase and never come back to this house.
One day you will wish you had asked me why I stayed.
The Korean Mafia boss fired the black housekeeper. Then his late mother's final video changed The Ha Mansion had survived rival gang wars, corrupt police raids, and one very awkward Thanksgiving hosted for a business partner who didn't understand chopsticks. It had never survived a woman with a suitcase and a warning. Somewhere between the rain and the silence, the most feared man in Seoul was about to learn that empires don't fall to bullets. They fall to the people you send away without saying thank you. Do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you want to catch every twist as this unfolds, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Share it with someone who loves a good redemption story. Now, back to Tae-jun, who was about to learn that pride is the most expensive thing a man can wear. Kang Tae-jun did not believe in signs, omens, or bad luck, mostly because he had never needed to. Bad luck was a concept invented for men who did not employ 40 armed guards and a lawyer on permanent retainer. He believed in leverage, timing, and the particular silence that fell over a room when he walked into it, a silence he found extremely convenient and only slightly lonely, though he would rather have eaten glass than admit that second part out loud. The mansion ran on schedules tighter than a surgeon's. Breakfast at 7, security briefing at 8, threats returned by 9, usually before his coffee had cooled, because in this business, punctuality mattered, even in cruelty. And every morning, without fail, one woman moved through the chaos of his household like she owned the place and was simply too polite to mention it. Amara Whitfield had been raised by a mother who taught her that dignity was not something other people could hand you or take away, and a father whose file, had Tae-jun ever bothered to actually read it, would have changed the entire trajectory of his life roughly 3 years earlier than it eventually did. She folded his shirts with the crisp irritation of a woman who found him mildly ridiculous. She corrected his Korean honorifics when he mocked her accent, which he did often, and which she tolerated the way one tolerates a large, expensive dog that occasionally knocks things over. "You're late for your own interrogation schedule," she told him one morning, setting down his coffee with a precision that suggested she had once considered a career in either fine dining or explosives disposal. "The men you're planning to threaten today have been waiting in the East Wing for 11 minutes. It's rude." "They can wait," Tae-jun said, not looking up from his tablet. "Fear improves with age, like wine." "Fear improves with consistency," she replied. "Wine improves with age. You're mixing your metaphors again, young master." He looked up at that, mostly because nobody in his organization corrected his grammar and lived to discuss it twice. But Amara only refilled his cup and walked away, unbothered, the way she walked away from everything, as though she had already survived his worst before he'd even attempted it. She had, in fact, though he did not know that yet. The rain started on a Tuesday, the kind of rain that Seoul specializes in, relentless and theatrical, as if the sky itself had taken acting classes. That was the night the documents disappeared from the study, papers connecting the Ha family to a decades-old deal with a syndicate that had been presumed dead, buried, and thoroughly cremated. They were not dead. They were, in fact, extremely alive and extremely interested in reclaiming what they believed was theirs. Tae-jun tore through the mansion like a man who had never once considered that patience might be a leadership skill. Furniture flipped. Staff questioned. Voices raised in the specific register reserved for men who have never had to apologize for anything in their adult lives. And when the trail, entirely circumstantial and largely fueled by panic, led to the housekeeper's quarters, he did not pause to consider 7 years of loyalty, competence, or the woman who had never once given him a reason to distrust her. He fired her on the spot. "You have 1 hour," he said, arms crossed, radiating the particular confidence of a man who has never once been proven catastrophically wrong. "Pack your things." Amara did not argue. She did not cry. She simply looked at him with the calm, terrifying patience of a woman filing away every word for later use, and said, "You will regret this before the week is out." He laughed. Actually laughed, the sound bouncing off marble that had heard gunfire and never once flinched. If you think firing the one person who actually kept this house standing was the dumbest decision a man has ever made in a bathrobe of arrogance, drop a comment below and let him know. Hit subscribe if you believe loyalty deserves better than this. Only the villains of this story, the proud, the petty, and the terminally stubborn, will scroll past without smashing that button. She left an hour later, coat soaked, suitcase small, dignity intact. He had no idea he had just fired the only person standing between his family and a war he didn't know was already starting. Amara Whitfield spent her first night as an unemployed woman in a small rented room above a laundromat that smelled permanently of fabric softener and other people's regrets. She did not cry there either. She simply sat by the window, watching Seoul blink through the rain, and waited. The way a woman waits when she already knows exactly how a story ends because she wrote half of it herself. Back at the mansion, the silence she left behind was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows a slammed door, thick and accusing, settling into every room like dust that refused to be swept. The staff noticed first. Breakfast arrived 12 minutes late and slightly burnt, a crime that would have been unthinkable under Amara's reign. The houseplants, which she had quietly rescued from neglect for 7 years, began drooping with the theatrical suddenness of background characters who had only ever survived because someone cared enough to water them. Even the guards, men trained to feel nothing, felt something, though none of them dared say her name out loud, as if it were a curse word that might summon consequences. Taejun told himself he did not notice. He told himself this while standing in his study at midnight, staring at a coffee that had gone cold because nobody had thought to remind him it existed. He told himself this while rereading the same business report 4 times without absorbing a single word. Pride, he was discovering, was an excellent insulation against feeling anything, right up until it wasn't. It was his aunt, arriving unannounced 2 days later to inspect the family estate the way older relatives do when they smell chaos from 3 neighborhoods away, who insisted the late mother's room finally be cleaned and prepared for renovation. Nobody had touched it properly in years. Amara had maintained it out of duty, not permission to redecorate, and now, with her gone, someone had to actually go inside and do the terrifying work of moving furniture that had not been moved since a funeral. The cleaners worked carefully, the way people work when superstition and fear share equal weight in their chest. It was one of them, a young man more interested in his phone than his job, who knocked against the base of an old wardrobe and heard the distinct, cinematic sound of hollow wood. Beneath a loose floor panel sat a small wooden box, dust thick enough to write your name in, and inside it, a single flash drive with a label that made even the ant go quiet. "Play this only after I am gone." Taejun held the drive in his palm that evening like it might detonate, which, emotionally speaking, it was about to. If you've ever found something from someone you lost and felt the ground tilt slightly under your feet, you already know exactly the kind of silence that filled that study. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a moment like that, where the past reached forward and grabbed you by the collar. He inserted the drive with the reluctant curiosity of a man opening a letter he suspects is a resignation, and in a way, it was. The screen flickered. His mother's face appeared, composed, elegant, wearing the particular expression of a woman who had rehearsed this speech in the mirror more times than she would ever admit. She did not smile. She did not soften the blow with pleasantries. She simply looked into the camera as though she could see directly through the screen, through the years, into whatever poor decision he had just made to trigger this recording being watched. "If you are seeing this," she said, "then something has already gone wrong, and knowing you, it likely involves your temper." Taejun sat very still, the way men sit when they suspect they are about to be exposed by someone who loved them enough to prepare for exactly this moment. "There is a woman in this house," his mother continued, "who owes you nothing, and yet has protected this family more than any guard you have ever hired. If you have let her go, you have made the worst mistake of your life. And I suspect I already know why." The recording paused there, almost cruelly, as though his mother had choreographed suspense from beyond the grave with the precision of a woman who had always known her son better than he knew himself. Outside, the rain had not stopped. Neither, he realized with a cold and sinking certainty, had the danger he had just sent walking out into it. His mother's voice continued, steady as a woman reading a verdict she had written long before the trial began. "Her name is Amara. Her father was Elijah Whitfield, an American security contractor who worked with your father decades ago, back when this family still had enemies sharp enough to draw blood. When the song syndicate came for us in the worst way imaginable, it was Elijah who intercepted them, at a cost that took his life and nearly took mine. Before he died, I made him one promise, that his daughter would never want for protection, and that our family would repay a debt no amount of money could settle." Taejun's jaw tightened. He had grown up hearing fragments of that old war, the kind of stories older relatives told at funerals when the wine loosened their guilt. He had never once connected them to the quiet woman who ironed his shirts and rolled her eyes at his jokes. "I placed her in this house not as a servant," his mother said, "but as a guardian, disguised as one, because visibility is the fastest way to get someone killed in our world. She has spent 7 years watching over this family without a single one of you knowing it, including you." The video paused on his mother's face, calm, unblinking, letting the weight of it settle the way good storytellers let silence do the heavy lifting. "Those documents you accused her of stealing," she continued, "were moved by her the moment she noticed unfamiliar men photographing our property from the road. She protected what she has always protected, and you rewarded her loyalty by throwing her into the rain." Taejun closed his eyes. Somewhere in his chest, an emotion he did not have a name for was assembling itself out of guilt, shame, and the particular horror of realizing he had spent years mocking the one person keeping him alive. The recording ended there, his mother's face fading to black with the quiet finality of a woman who trusted her son to finish the rest of the story himself, for better or worse. He did not get long to sit with his guilt. Within the hour, the mansion's silent alarms lit up the security room like a Christmas tree assembled by people who had given up on subtlety. Men in dark clothing moved along the eastern perimeter, cutting through fencing with the calm efficiency of people who had clearly been waiting, patiently, for the one obstacle standing between them and this house to be removed. They had not come for jewelry. They had come for the documents Amara had already hidden, and for a family that, without her, had never actually been as untouchable as Taejun believed. Gunfire cracked through the rain. Guards who had spent years lounging around a mansion that never saw real danger suddenly remembered what their training was actually for. Taejun grabbed a weapon he had not used in years, hands steadier with rage than with fear, and understood, in the worst possible way, exactly how right his mother had been. If you've ever underestimated someone quiet in your life, someone who did more for you than you ever noticed, you already know the particular sting of this chapter. Let me know below if you've ever had a wake-up call like this, the kind that arrives far too late and far too loud. The syndicate men were fast but disorganized, the kind of chaos that comes from a plan built around a single missing variable. That variable stood exactly where Amara had once stood every single day, unnoticed and essential. They did not know she was gone. They had planned around her presence, her instincts, her habit of noticing things 3 seconds before anyone else did. Without her, the mansion's defense fractured in exactly the places she used to quietly patch. Taejun fought through smoke and rain, and the sick understanding that his own pride had done more damage to his family in 1 week than any rival gang had managed in a decade. Somewhere beneath the noise, one truth settled into him with the weight of a verdict. He had not lost documents. He had lost his shield. And now he had to find her, not to apologize, though he owed her that too. But because the war she had spent years quietly preventing had finally arrived, and he had no idea how to survive it without her. The mansion, by morning, looked like a battlefield curated by someone with excellent taste in destruction. Shattered glass glittered across marble floors that had never known a scratch. Furniture lay overturned in the east wing, and the security team, humbled in a way payroll alone could never achieve, moved through the wreckage with the particular silence of men reevaluating their life choices. Taejun stood in the middle of it, soaked, bruised, and holding a phone with 43 missed calls from people who wanted answers he did not have. The syndicate had retreated before dawn, not defeated, only delayed, the way a fire retreats when it runs out of easy fuel and starts planning where to strike next. He had survived the night. His family had survived the night. But survival, he was quickly learning, felt remarkably similar to failure when the one person who could have prevented all of it was somewhere out in the city, coatless in the memory of rain, because he had thrown her out over a mistake she never made. His aunt found him standing in the ruined study, staring at the space where the documents used to sit, and said the kind of thing older relatives say when they've run out of patience for watching you suffer alone. "You know where she works now, don't you?" she said. It was not a question. Her father's old contact, the one who runs security consulting 3 blocks from the old textile district. Taejun did not ask how his aunt knew this. Women who survive decades in this family always seem to know things nobody officially tells them, an inheritance more valuable than money. He found the address by noon, a modest office above a noodle shop that smelled significantly better than his own kitchen had in the 7 years he apparently never appreciated who ran it. He stood outside for a full 10 minutes, rehearsing an apology that sounded, in his head, dignified and composed, and that he suspected would come out, in reality, as something closer to a man drowning in his own arrogance. Amara opened the door before he even knocked, unsurprised, arms crossed, the exact posture of a woman who had been expecting this visit roughly since the moment she packed her suitcase. "You look terrible," she said. "Did the house survive?" "Barely," he admitted. "How did you know they'd come?" "I didn't know when," she said. "I knew eventually. I've been watching those men circle this family for months. You just didn't have the patience to ask why I kept insisting on new locks." The words landed like a slap wrapped in politeness, which, he was realizing, was her signature style. "I saw the video," he said. "My mother's message. I know who you are, who your father was, what you've actually been doing in that house." Something flickered across her face then, brief and unguarded, the first real crack he had ever seen in her composure. "She wasn't supposed to leave that for you to find like this," she said quietly. "She was supposed to tell you herself, when you were ready to hear it without your ego getting in the way." "I wasn't ready," he admitted. "I'm still not sure I am, but I know I was wrong. About the documents. About you. About 7 years of assuming the woman running my household was simply staff, when she was the reason I still had a household to run." Amara studied him for a long moment, the rain from that Tuesday still sitting between them like unfinished business. "An apology doesn't undo a week of feeling disposable," she said. "You don't get to fire someone, discover they were protecting your entire bloodline, and expect a tidy little redemption arc because you finally said sorry with the right amount of guilt in your voice." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for tidy. I'm asking for a chance to actually deserve you being there, properly, as an equal, not staff, not a secret, not a debt my mother assigned you to carry. My family owes you a life. I intend to spend the rest of mine paying part of that back, whether or not you ever forgive me for the part where I was an idiot. If you've ever had to decide whether someone truly deserves a second chance or just deserves to sit in the consequences of what they did, you already know how heavy this moment is. Tell me below what you think Amara should do, because trust me, she's about to make him work for every inch of it." Amara did not answer right away. She simply stepped back from the doorway, just far enough to leave room, and said, "You can come in, but you're carrying the boxes. All of them." Consider it your first lesson in earning things instead of assuming you're owed them. For the first time in 7 years, Taejun smiled like a man who had actually learned something. The office above the noodle shop became, over the following weeks, an unlikely headquarters for the quiet war neither of them had chosen, but both now had to finish. Amara did not simply forgive and return to folding shirts, and Taejun, to his credit, did not expect her to. Instead, she set terms with the precision of a woman negotiating a hostage release, which, in a sense, she was. "I'm not coming back as your housekeeper," she said, arranging files across a desk that had clearly seen more competent crisis management in 1 week than his entire security team managed in years. "I'm coming back as head of family security, with full authority, a real salary, and the power to fire anyone who questions my judgment, including you, if it comes to that." "You want to be my boss?" he said, somewhere between disbelief and reluctant admiration. "I want to be the reason you're still alive next year," she corrected. "The title is just paperwork." He signed the agreement without reading it twice, which, considering his history of catastrophic decisions made without reading things twice, was either deeply reckless or the first genuinely good instinct he'd had in a decade. The Song Syndicate, however, did not care about corporate restructuring. They cared about the documents, and the fact that their first attempt had failed spectacularly against a house that, without warning, suddenly had its guardian back. Amara moved through the mansion in the following days, like a woman rebuilding a fortress from memory, correcting weaknesses she had clearly cataloged years ago and simply never had the authority to fix. "Your Eastgate camera has had a blind spot for 6 years," she told the security chief, a man twice her size, who nonetheless flinched like a schoolboy. "I mentioned it in a memo in year 2. Nobody read it. Naturally. If you've ever pointed out a problem, gotten ignored, and then watched everyone panic when that exact problem blew up in their faces later, comment below, because Amara's patience for saying "I told you so" is a masterclass we could all learn from. The final confrontation came on a night that felt, appropriately, exactly like the rainy Tuesday that started this entire mess, as though the universe had a flair for narrative symmetry. The syndicate struck the estate directly this time, no longer bothering with subtlety, arriving with the confidence of men who assumed the housekeeper's absence had been the only thing standing between them and victory. They had not accounted for her return. Amara directed the defense from the command room with the calm authority of someone who had clearly been preparing her entire life for this exact night, rerouting guards, sealing corridors, anticipating each move the intruders made 2 steps before they made it. Taejun fought alongside his men in the courtyard, no longer the arrogant boss who assumed fear alone would protect his empire, but a man finally understanding that real power was built on people, not intimidation. The syndicate's leader, a wiry man with the entitled confidence of someone who believed old debts simply expired with enough patience, cornered Taejun near the ruined garden his mother once tended. "Your father's debt should have died with your mother," the man sneered. "We're simply collecting what's owed." "You're collecting nothing," Amara said, stepping out from the shadows with the exact timing of a woman who had clearly rehearsed this entrance in her head for years. "My father died settling that debt. I'm not letting you reopen an account that's already closed." What followed was less a fight than a reckoning, Amara moving through the syndicate's remaining men with a precision that made it embarrassingly obvious she had been underestimated by everyone in this story, including, especially, the man who once fired her over a suitcase and a suspicion. By dawn, the syndicate's leader was in custody, the estate was secure, and Taejun stood in the wreckage of yet another battle, watching Amara wipe rain and blood from her hands with the unbothered efficiency of a woman finishing a mildly annoying chore. "You saved this family twice now," he said. "Once as a secret, once as someone I actually deserved to have standing beside me." "Don't get sentimental," she said, though the corner of her mouth betrayed her. "You're still carrying boxes for the next 6 months. Consider it interest on your debt. If loyalty like this deserves to be celebrated instead of punished, Hit that like button before we close out this story, because what happens next between them is exactly the redemption this whole mess has been building toward. The weeks after the syndicate's collapse moved differently, the way a house moves differently after a storm has finally passed, and everyone inside has to relearn what quiet actually sounds like. The mansion healed in patches, broken windows replaced, scorched garden beds slowly coaxed back to life, though some scars, Taijun was learning, were never meant to fully disappear. They were meant to be remembered, the way a scar reminds you not to touch fire the same way twice. Amara ran her new department with the same brisk efficiency she once brought to laundry and dinner schedules, except now her memos actually got read, mostly because she had developed a habit of attaching consequences to the ones that didn't. The security team, humbled beyond recognition, followed her instructions with the devotion of men who had learned, violently and personally, exactly what her judgment was worth. Even the aunt, notoriously difficult to impress, started referring to her as the reason this family still has a pulse, which, for a woman who rarely complimented anyone under the age of 60, was practically a marriage proposal. Taejun changed too, though slower, and with the particular clumsiness of a man unlearning decades of assuming respect was owed rather than earned. He started asking questions instead of issuing verdicts. He started listening in meetings instead of simply waiting for his turn to sound intimidating. And he carried boxes, every single one Amara handed him over those 6 months, without complaint, partly out of guilt, partly because he had quietly started to enjoy the ordinary rhythm of being useful to someone instead of feared by everyone. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday. No rain this time, sunlight cutting cleanly through the mansion's tall windows, that he found her in his mother's old room, the one she had once guarded with the seriousness of a vault, and now visited simply because she missed the woman who had trusted her with everything. "You still come in here," he said, standing in the doorway the way he once avoided doing entirely. "She was the only person in this house who ever treated me like more than my job," Amara said, running her fingers along the edge of the old cabinet where the wooden box had once been hidden. It felt right to keep some part of that alive. "She'd be furious at me," he said, "for how I treated you. For 7 years of assuming loyalty like yours just came standard with the house." "She'd be furious," Amara agreed. "But she'd also tell you that people don't get remembered for the mistake they made. They get remembered for what they did after they realized it." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the old bed, the wood creaking under him the way it probably had for his mother 100 quiet mornings before. "I've been thinking about what you said, about earning things instead of assuming I'm owed them. And I don't want you running my security department because my mother assigned you a debt to repay," he said. "I don't want any of this between us to exist because of an old promise made before either of us had a say in it." Amara turned to face him fully now, arms no longer crossed, which, for a woman who had spent months keeping a very deliberate distance between them, was its own kind of confession. "Then what do you want?" she asked, though her voice had lost its usual edge of practiced sarcasm. "I want you to stay because you choose to," he said. "Not because of your father, not because of my mother, not because of a debt neither of us asked for. I want to actually deserve you standing next to me the way I clearly didn't 7 years ago and the way I'm still figuring out how to now." The room went quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that settles after truth has finally been spoken instead of avoided. "You're still terrible at emotional speeches," Amara said eventually, though the corner of her mouth curved in a way that undercut every word of the insult. "I'm working on it," he said. "I have a very patient teacher." "You have an extremely patient teacher," she corrected, who is still deciding whether patience is a virtue or a personality flaw at this point. He laughed, the real kind, the kind that had been rare in that house for as long as anyone could remember, and for a moment the mansion that once ran on fear and silence felt, instead, like an actual home. Months later, at a small gathering held in the newly restored garden his mother once tended, staff and old family allies gathered to mark the anniversary of the night everything nearly fell apart. Amara stood near the entrance, no longer in the plain uniform of a housekeeper, dressed instead as the head of an operation that had quite literally saved this family twice, and Taejun found himself watching her the way he once watched rival gang leaders. Except now the feeling in his chest had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something far more inconvenient and far more permanent. "You're staring," she said, without even turning to look at him. "I'm admiring," he corrected. "There's a difference." "Barely," she said, though she stepped closer anyway, close enough that the distance she had spent months carefully maintaining had quietly, finally, disappeared. The empire that once ran on fear now ran on something sturdier, something his mother had understood decades before he ever did. Loyalty could not be bought, threatened, or inherited through bloodlines alone. It had to be recognized, protected, and, when foolishly thrown away, earned back through humility rather than apology. Taejun had once believed power lived in the fear he could inspire. He understood now that real power had been quietly serving him coffee every morning for 7 years, correcting his grammar, guarding his mother's secrets, and waiting, with more patience than he deserved, for him to finally notice. The rain that started this story never fully left Seoul's memory that year, returning every so often to remind the city of the night an empire nearly fell. But inside the Ha mansion, under a sky finally clear, the quiet woman the world had chosen to overlook was no longer overlooked by anyone, least of all the man who once made the greatest mistake of his life and spent every day after making sure he never made it again. The first snow of the season fell over Seoul exactly 1 year after the night the Ha estate nearly burned to the ground, and this time, nobody in the mansion mistook the quiet for danger. Amara stood at the window of what used to be her late employer's forbidden room, now simply a study she used when she needed silence to think, watching the flakes settle over the garden that had, against every reasonable expectation, bloomed twice since the fire. She heard him before she saw him, the particular unhurried footsteps of a man who had finally learned that walking into a room did not require announcing his dominance over it first. "The board finalized the security contracts," Taejun said, holding 2 cups of tea instead of the coffee he used to demand at all hours like a man allergic to patience. "Under your name. Full authority. No conditions." "No conditions," Amara repeated, taking the cup, testing the words the way she tested most things he said now, carefully, for hidden strings. "That's a first." "I've had a year of practice," he said. "Turns out humility, much like tea, gets easier to swallow the more often you're forced to drink it." She allowed herself a small laugh, the kind she had once rationed carefully in this house, back when laughing near him felt like handing over a weapon he might one day use against her. She no longer worried about that. He had spent 12 months proving, in small, unglamorous ways, boxes carried, memos read, apologies delivered without an audience to perform them for, that the man who once fired her over a suspicion was not the man standing in front of her now. The Song Syndicate's remaining allies had scattered in the months following that final battle, their leverage over the Ha family evaporating along with the old debt Amara's father had died, settling decades earlier. What remained was not a war, but a rebuilding, slower and less cinematic than gunfire and stolen documents, though in its own way, far harder to survive. "I got a letter today," Amara said, setting her cup down, "from a security firm in Los Angeles. They want to hire me. Real money. No mafia. No mothers leaving cryptic flash drives behind furniture." Taejun's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes did. The particular stillness of a man bracing for a loss he knew, deep down, he had no right to prevent. "And what did you tell them?" he asked, careful, the way a man asks a question he is genuinely afraid to hear answered. "I told them," she said, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him suffer for every ounce of arrogance he'd ever shown her, "that I already have a job. One that pays considerably worse in patience, but considerably better in everything else that actually matters." He exhaled, the breath of a man who had, for one terrifying second, imagined an empire without her in it, and found the idea unbearable in a way gunfire and rival gangs had never once managed to be. "You're staying," he said, not quite a question. "I'm staying," she confirmed. "Someone has to make sure you don't fire the next person who actually saves your life." Outside, the snow continued falling over a mansion that had once run on fear and now ran on something far more durable, the quiet, unglamorous work of two people who had learned the hard way that loyalty given freely is worth infinitely more than loyalty assumed as a right. Kang Tae-jun had spent his whole life believing that power meant never needing anyone. He understood now, standing in a room his mother once guarded with her final secret, that real power had been standing beside him for 8 years, unnoticed, underestimated, and ultimately unbreakable. The empire that feared nothing had nearly lost everything to its own pride. It survived, in the end, not because of guns or threats or the reputation that once preceded him into every room, but because one woman the world had chosen to overlook decided, against every reasonable instinct, to give a foolish man exactly one more chance. And this time, he made sure he was worthy of it.